What's poppin', guys? It's Venomystera back with another StarCraft 2 video. This time in honor of the 8th anniversary of StarCraft 2's release, we have a game played on a throwback retro map that is Lost Temple, and it's between myself and a buddy of mine. It's going to be Savagewood vs ARamp, TvZ on Lost Temple. This is sort of one of those classic quintessential matchups that never gets old. And in terms of Lost Temple, this map was played until the cows came home in Brood War. This was sort of considered the standard macro map that everyone looked to and played, which is sort of funny because if you look back at it in retrospect, it's not very good for Zerg. There is this big cliff overlooking the natural expansion, and there is no ramp up on this cliff. And I'm sure many of you veteran players already know all about this map and know how it usually plays out. But I know a lot of younger, sort of newer, more newbie players have subscribed to this channel. So I don't just assume that everyone is a 8-year veteran of this game. I like to go into detail and explain the finer points of the game. So let's talk about this map on a very basic level. Lost Temple TvZ. The crux of the issue is this big high ground up here. Now this high ground is extremely powerful for Terran. You will see tank drops up here, Thor drops up here, sometimes even bunkers up here. And this is important because whenever you drop stuff on the high ground, it can affect the Zerg natural, and Zergs rely primarily on queens and lings to defend in the early game. Now, queens get 3 shot by Thors, they die very quickly, and it is worth noting that both this gold base, which is usually taken as a third, and the natural expansion are in peril of this high ground, and there's no ramp. It's not like that map Condemned Ridge from 2012, where there was this big ramp above your base, but you could just run up there with lings. No, you have to actually have stuff that either flies or have a Nidus or a Dropper Lord to get up on this high ground. Now, the reason that I'm casting this game, it's actually going to be a best of 3 between myself and my clanmate and real-life friend ARamp. As you see, Savagewood makes a Marine to deny scouting, and then he's going to make a tech lab. And he's made a bunker to boot. It is the 8th anniversary of StarCraft 2. StarCraft 2 came out way back in summer of 2010, and if you want to see what the retro games were like from pro gamers back in that time, I have a series called The Venomous Classics, where I take a look back at old games, and I actually casted a game from the beta between Idra and a Korean pro gamer named Tester, and they even played a game on this map, Lost Temple. Now, it is worth noting that Lost Temple was a map in the original couple map pools of StarCraft 2. The first few map pools did feature this map, despite the fact that this cliff existed, and it was very difficult for Zerg. Blizzard ended up modifying this map into a map called Shattered Temple, where this high ground actually got turned into a ramp that led off into this base that was actually obstructed by rocks here and here instead of an island. That made it better for Zerg, worse for Terran. You know, interestingly enough, that was still not all that great of a map, even though you didn't have to deal with islands. Now, it's very weird for Zerg because back in the day, you couldn't just make a quick Dropper Lord after Evo. You had to actually upgrade up to Lair to get drop, and then it was 200 to get drops. And then if you knew what you were doing, you were of course going to get Overlord speed because the Overlords barely moved at all. Back in 2012, there was a very significant patch that made Overlords move at a faster rate. Now, of course, it is worth noting that they ended up moving the Overlord speed upgrade down to hatchery tech. So it was pretty much harder for Zerg all around. And when you consider that the Queen had shorter melee range, shorter air range, it also made it even more difficult for Zerg to deal with. So you didn't have the Dropper Lord as early, you didn't have a Queen that was as useful, and the Roach could not turn into the Ravager. So it was very useful. And here we can see Savagewood opening up for a Thor ship drop here. He's going for +1, getting double gas at his natural. And he's also opted for a Liberator here. So what has ARamp done? He's opted for Hydras, and it looks like he's gotten a fast infestation pit. And he's trying to get out some infestors. But he has made the mistake of building his Nidus Worm in vision of the high ground. And here we're going to see Savagewood go to work on these queens, and here we'll see how quickly queens die as the Thor mows a queen down ruthlessly. And this is interesting because back in the day, there weren't units like the Liberator, and by the time Lost Temple was gone, the queen had not been buffed. Lost Temple had sort of been phased out of the map pool by the time the queen had been buffed. So this is sort of weird and interesting when we see a retro map used in a sense like this, because ARamp here, he might have some overlords out on the outskirts of the map, but Savagewood here has a Thor, and we can see that ARamp did try to make a dropper lord to deal with this, but it was just a little bit too late. And here infestors are, and ARamp ran up to try to throw some infested Terran up on the high ground, but if you look at his vision, it's all fog of war. You have to have an overlord up there to deal with this. In other words, in order to even throw infested Terran up there, you have to have vision. Savagewood dealt with the Nidus network. He's going to deal with the infestation pit, and ARamp is having a terrible time dealing with this. His money is starting to balloon. He can't really take a decent third base because who wants to take a third base out here in vision of the other cliff? And it appears as though Savagewood not only has a Liberator set up to protect the danger zone of his Thor, but the Thor is wailing away at the Hydra Den. And ARamp is in a terrible position because it looked like if it had been another 30 seconds, he might have been able to drop units up here. And he's trying to actually drop queens up here. He throws some infested Terran up here as he finally gets some high ground vision, but without the Overlord speed upgrade, he's going to be in some trouble here as the infested Terran make the Liberator unsiege, but the Thor is going to be dropped in the main, and it's so bad for ARamp as he's lost a ton of drones. And ARamp GG's after losing 13 workers, so let's just pause and take count of what happened. ARamp was focusing very hard on countering this Thor drop, and he made a dropper Overlord, but on this map it's very hard to take a third, and it just wasn't able to work out for ARamp. He was actually doing pretty well up until the point where the Thor got dropped, and then his money started to balloon and he started to get into some trouble here after the high ground vision got cleared. And Savagewood, he didn't just go for a Thor drop, but he went for a Liberator plus Thor drop combo. And that is very interesting when you consider the fact that back in the day, the Liberator was not even an option. So ARamp, if you sort of look at what he did, it was sort of a queen-centric defense. He had 4 queens, and queens aren't exactly good against the Thor per se, but he was doing his best to counter it. You know, he was starting to get some decent creep spread out, and he even saw the Thor in his vision here. But once the Thor got cooking, it was very difficult for him. And of course, back in the day, the Thor didn't have this high impact payload where it did extra damage to non-light air units. And right here we see ARamp desperately trying to make a dropper lord, but at this point his drone line is under siege and his extractor was under siege. And if you don't have Overlord speed and you're sort of just relying on a very simple elevator play and your Overlord dies, you don't really have a counter. And we can see here that Savagewood had made another base and was trying to make more factories. But ARamp was just screwed at this point. He made all this tech, he sort of made it in the wrong place, and once that happens and you lose your foothold, it's very hard to come back in the game. Now it's worth noting that top Zergs very frequently will saturate their main base and then have all of their tech and all of the drones rallied out to their natural and just make their tech at their natural. We can see here that after falling behind, ARamp started to make some tech in his main, and if we go to units, he had 23 drones. He was too far behind to win with no third base. Savagewood did have a third base made and about to land at the gold, and he had some Banshees on the way. So let's move on to the second game here. Now it is going to be a rematch on Lost Temple, and that's for a very important reason. In that first game I wanted to showcase how the high ground cliff drop of Lost Temple was so popular. And he had to ARamp, the Zerg player there. He had to worry about tank drop. He had to worry about Thor drop. He had to worry about Banshees. Now back in 2011 and 2010 when this map was in the rotation, the Overlord speed by default was much slower, so it was way harder to scout. And you could also spawn in close positions, which in that last game it was actually cross positions, which was the best thing for Zerg. But in this game we're going to see a close positions game. So Savagewood's up here in the top right, and if we just take a quick glance down in the bottom left, we see ARamp here, and he's in the bottom left. Now this is close positions. This means that the players are about one screen away from each other, and this is bad for Zerg. Zerg always wants as much time to prepare as they can possibly get. They always want as much time to scout and look around and get units ready as they can possibly get. And whenever they spawn close positions next to their opponent, it can be very difficult for them. And this game, of course, was played directly after Game 1, and after going for a very tech-focused Thor drop up on the high ground of the natural cliff of ARamp, Savage was going to go for a 2 barracks play. You know, this isn't proxy 2 racks, this isn't completely all in. However, this is your standard 2 racks play. This will probably be followed by a bunker. The Terran player essentially makes no gas geysers if you're not familiar with 2 racks. They get a depot and then 2 quick barracks. Scout around with an SCV. Hope they're as close to their ally or they hope they're as close to their enemy as possible whenever they do this play. And then they build a bunker with their scouting SCV and sort of go for a bunker rush. And if you've been following StarCraft for a long time, or hell, even if you've been following StarCraft for a short time, you're probably aware of the fact of what a bunker rush is. Now, if you don't know what a bunker rush is, if you sort of break StarCraft 2 down to its complete core and its bare bones viewpoint, then a bunker rush is like the quintessential Zerg versus Terran rush. The Terran player rushes out Marines, and the Zerg player sort of is always trying to expand and is forced to defend the Marines. And if a bunker goes up, especially in a spot where there's not much surface area, it can be hard for the Zerg to defend. And here we're watching ARamp's direct point of view, and he can see just now that his natural finish that there are 2 bunkers down. Now the goal of the bunker rush is to A, kill a lot of drones, B, force a lot of Zerglings, and C, kill the natural hatchery of the Zerg player. Now ARamp got lucky and his Overlord just barely lived with 15 HP. If you lose this Overlord, the situation is nearly unwinnable because you have to spend about 30 seconds right when you need the units the most, sitting there with your thumb up your bum, unable to produce units. And if we look at Savagewood's vision, he has foolishly gotten supply block, sort of butchering the execution of this rush. But it's just a very slight supply block as he does have 2 more depots coming down, and they finish. But whenever you do a rush like this, every little second counts, and I'm not going to sugarcoat and act like getting supply blocked at that juncture isn't a big deal. Very frequently though, players who are doing these very rush heavy or these very micro heavy rush builds can get distracted and forget a depot. And Savagewood has made 3 bunkers here, and he's just trying to choke off the natural expansion from being defended by ARamp. Now ARamp does lose his natural, he's making quite a few lings, he's trying to fight the bunker with his broodlings, but notice this bunker can only be attacked from this little surface area. That means that the SCVs were hidden away in this little cubby, and they were able to defend the bunker and repair it. Now Savagewood is in this weird position where He wants to do damage to ARamp's main, but he knows ARamp has been making units, and the fact that he's maybe even teched up to Roach, and we can see ARamp does have a few units out mid-map to prevent reinforcement, and this is good by ARamp. This is what you want to do. Have a few units out. You don't want them to just infinitely be able to rally Marines. And here we go. ARamp's going to try to engage into the bunkers. The bottom one is empty. Thankfully for ARamp, both the SCVs die. And because ARamp was cutting off reinforcements, these Marines are going to die. And the Marines are going to try to retreat into the last remaining bunker. But ARamp does clean up the bunker rush. He has lost his natural. Savagewood is finishing his orbital command here in the main, so he's not mining out of his natural yet, but he is doing well in terms of bases. This one, of course, has finished and is turning into an orbital, as I just said, and the hatchery for ARamp is just now starting. So this close positions thing is a double-edged sword. Now, of course, it does favor Terran, but in situations like this where Zerg is forced to make a lot of units early, as we see ARamp going for a lair here, of course he does already have roaches out. It means that the counter rush distance is very quick. Now Savagewood has elected to make double bunker here. Looks like he's going for another barracks as well as a factory. So Savagewood committed a lot to that 2 bunker rush, aka 2 racks, and he's probably going to have a trouble securing his natural here, as he doesn't really have anything but Marines. He really needs Marauders to deal with this Roach Ling pressure, and he won't even really be able to land his natural. But it looks like he's going to fly off into the Lost Temple island base. And it is worth noting that back in the day this would have been, you know, a borderline death knell for the Zerg, as of course he would have just now been able to start Overlord speed and then go into drop to deal with this. But in Legacy of the Void, you can just morph a couple Overlords and fly over. Even if they're slow Overlords, they can disrupt this. And of course, he did see it fly over with his little push. It will be interesting to see whether or not ARamp takes the trouble to actually fly over and do his due diligence. And it looks like he is getting Overlord speed as well as Roach speed, and a little bit of spreading onto the high ground as well as creep dropping. So this is good. One of the most challenging things about playing Zerg, whether it be pre or post patch, is simply figuring out what the heck Terran is doing. As ARamp tries to drop a couple corrosive biles, and Salvage is going to salvage the bunker as he does have a tank out. And it looks as though ARamp is going to do a little bit of a drop. So this is exactly what you want, as Savagewood did Mulehammer this island base and was clearly relying on it to get him ahead, as his natural was not in a good position to be taken. As you see, Savagewood is moving his tank out onto the cliff to try to clear his natural, but right as that happens, of course, the tank is not all-seeing. The island base is shut down by ARamp right as Overlord speed finishes. That's a brilliant move. But no matter where you put the tank on this high ground, you are always going to be able to park Zerg units somewhere where you're going to make Terran come down and force the issue on the low ground. As Savagewood does have 2 tanks out, but he's in a weird spot where he has lost mules. He does not have that many SCVs. He's actually behind on workers to the Terran, and he's in this awkward spot. It looks like he's going to try to go for 2-port Banshee here. ARamp does have a 3rd base out on the side, and of course his natural has been down for a while. It has a plethora of workers out here mining. He almost has optimal mineral saturation, and ARamp is actually going to do a roach drop here. And Savagewood does not have many units. He can't rely on tank siege because of the splash. He's going to move his Marines over. And with that 2nd base trying to be landed, it looks like he's going to leave his tanks. And Savagewood just lost a ton of units there. As you see, about an entire mineral line killed off there. And ARamp is about double Savagewood's workers. And without stem, Savagewood's not going to be able to kill off the Dropper Lords. So ARamp with some nice drop play is going to take the advantage back. Savagewood, simply put, wasn't ready for that drop and didn't have Marines with any upgrades at all. Just had your sort of vanilla Marines, you could say. And this is what I was talking about. no matter where Savagewood puts the tanks, ARamp can just defend the natural. So ARamp is in a pretty good position. He has decent creep spread. He's getting some spores to defend against drop play. He's getting a hydrogen and a nidus. He's gonna have to go back a bit here. As ARamp was getting this third base, which is where you want the third. See, contrary to popular belief, you don't actually want the third right here because Terran can basically siege it from their natural. This is where Artosis got his third when he won his GSL game in Close Positions Metalopolis. But this is really the bread and butter of Terran versus Zerg on this map. In other words, what do you have to worry about? You're so worried about the cliff drop, you're so worried about bunker rush, and all the other nonsense Terran can do. And ARamp, the double spores, sure they just came up, but it was a reaction to the 2-port Banshee play. And with the double Banshee, even though the cloak is very late, Savagewood is going to be able to do some damage, although right there without cloak, the 9 range queens are going to be able to fend the Banshees off. So because Savagewood was on one base and he was having so much trouble defending his natural and lost so many workers, the cloaking field was actually delayed on the Banshees. And even though there were a mere 2 Ravagers here, it significantly delayed the SCV transfer. And quite frankly, because of that cute little drop that ARamp did, Savagewood is still behind. And it looks like Ravagers are going to come in here, and if they're smart, they'll drop biles on the tanks. They do, and both tanks go down. As Savagewood is having a hard time spending his money, as it looks like he's trying to go into some sort of mech. He doesn't have any bio upgrades. This is a downright dirty game. Both players are being harassed severely, meaning that they are significantly more likely to float money and make mistakes. We can see ARamp has been forced to make 5 spore crawlers here to deal with the Banshees, and a little bit of a Roach Ravager push is going to come in. But Roach Ravager is countered by Banshees. Savagewood does try to focus onto the Ravagers there and does get them. Now thankfully for ARamp, close positions means that he does have creep basically at the front door. Savagewood says, holy crap, there's creep at my front door. He's going to try to take that out with a nice little shift A move. But with 2 queens out here, Savagewood might be in a little trouble, but finally Cloak finishes. And he'll probably scan again because having creep at your front door as Terran is not pleasant. And we can see the third base here goes down to a Banshee. You might be saying, wow, it died to 1 Banshee. Well, whenever the other player is in close positions to you and you're forced to sort of expand way off into the middle of nowhere, it's almost impossible to defend. You can't really get Hydras out there, you can't really get a Spore Crawler up there. And ARamp is just trying to make units here, as at this point he has lost a handful of workers himself, and because he was running on low econ and trying to do some Roach Ling pressure, at this point the game has gone into a very low eco form. Both players at about 30 workers or less, and this is what happens when you spawn right on top of your opponent, as the players are about, if we can see the bunkers here in the top right, are right about on top of the main base plateau, and Savagewood is doing everything he can to clear creep. If we go to ARamp's vision, his creep has been severely dissipated despite the fact that he did a good job spreading it. And Savagewood has 2 Banshees out here harassing ARamp. Now this one's a little bit lazy. However, a Gas Geyser does go down there for ARamp, and at this point he's oversaturated on his minerals. He's just doing everything he can to make a Roachling Queen army, and he's going to press across the map with Overseers and try to break Savagewood. Savagewood is getting after this Roach Warren, and it looks like ARamp might be all in here, as Savagewood has sort of a shoddy, half-finished wall ready. But with a lot of Lings, this wall really won't hold up that well. This army for ARamp is really only limited by the speed of the Queens. Savagewood destroys the Roach Warren, that is so valuable. He's going to start working on the lair, as ARamp doesn't really have much that can deal with air at this point, as he is really focused on trying to do this bust, and with virtually no drones, all he can afford is a handful of slow hydras, and he's trying to make a few spore crawlers deal with it, but he's just going to try to go for it here. A tank is on the high ground. He gets a decent surround onto the double bunker depot combo. ARamp's army is taking quite a bit of heat here, as in the 8th anniversary of StarCraft, you see a classic engagement on Lost Temple going on, and it looks like ARamp's attack might just barely peter out, as he at the end is floating a lot of money, but he had to pull his queens to attack. He sort of ran out of larvae here, and he's just going to leave. So if we take a brief look back at what happened, ARamp a few minutes ago had good creep, he had a third base, and he didn't have many drones. So what happened? Savagewood used the power of 2-port Banshee to limit ARamp's options. First he kills the third base, then he starts to kill the gas and the tech. And it might seem sort of like, oh, well, ARamp just made a mistake and didn't macro that well. Well, that might be partially true, but what you really have to consider is the fact that not only was ARamp severely harassed, but on Lost Temple he had so many possibilities he had to deal with. He went into the game probably thinking, this guy's probably going to Thor or tank drop me on the high ground. He did it last game. It's clearly the most powerful option for this map. However, his opponent went for 2 racks into 2-port Banshee, a very unorthodox play on this map. And then after limiting his creep and sniping his tech in third base, Savagewood put ARamp in a very precarious situation where he was sort of forced to say, well, I have so few workers and not that many queens or infrastructure or a third, where if my opponent's going for a sort of mech play in close positions Lost Temple, I'm just not going to be able to deal with it, so I'm going to go for a big push. And perhaps if ARamp had macro just a little better, he would have won. But when you're being constantly harassed, have very few workers and no queens, macroing well is easier said than done. As we see double Banshees here, they're going to kill the Roachhorn. There's nothing really ARamp can do if you move the Spore. It either dies or gets maneuvered around. And at this point, this is something many Zergs sort of make a mistake of, which is over microing, focusing too hard on your army. And we can see here that ARamp does fire up another queen, but obviously when he intended to push out, he was thinking, well, I'll be at the front door in no time with my queens and I'll be able to bust him. But then that awful moment for him hit where he realized, well, crap, I don't have any creep. I can't really attack until I lay a couple tumors. So he lays a couple tumors and suddenly the Warren is gone, the extra Spore is gone, the lair is gone, and then he's just on one base. So he does the big desperation attack. And although he kills quite a bit, this tank is just going ham up on the high ground. And the lair is going to go down. Remember, this base was sniped. As even though Savagewood pulls back a little bit there to pull the queen out of vision range, so he can snipe it and move back to the lair is basically dead. There's no way it lives. And ARamp loses a close game. And I'm not casting these games to brag or be cute or act like they're GSL quality games. It's StarCraft's 8th birthday, and I thought it would be interesting to take a look back at Terran versus Zerg, and even revisit the matchup years later, whenever it was not so hard for Zerg. Because maps like Lost Temple proved that keeping Zerg guessing and mixing up your strategy is a great way to go. As you saw the very potent Thor drop in the first game, and then the 2 racks into 2-port in the second game. Make sure you rate, comment, like, and subscribe.